Welcome to the Writers' Museum. Lady Stair's house. Situated within Lady Stair's house, on the Lawn Market, near Edinburgh Castle. This house was built as a family home in 1622 by wealthy merchant William Gray. The carved lintel over the main entrance bears his initials and those of his wife, Gada Smith. And when it was built, this building was one of the largest and most luxurious homes in Edinburgh. The initials of William Gray and his wife, Gada Smith, over the main doorway. Sir William died in 1648, but his wife continued to live here for many years, and the house, and nearby alleyway, or close, as it's known in Scotland, became known as Lady Gray's in her honour. In the early 1700s, the house was acquired by Gray's granddaughter, Elizabeth. Elizabeth had married into the rich and powerful Dalrymple family and had become the Countess Dowager of Stair. Following the death of her husband, Elizabeth took up residence in the house and continued to reside there until her own death in 1731. During this time, the house and close became known as Lady Stair's. Following her death, the house had various occupants, but by the end of the 19th century, it had fallen into ruin. Lady Stair's house, Lawn Market, 1895. Bruce J. Home. Pencil and wash on paper. It was destined for demolition until the conservationist Patrick Geddes suggested that it was in the city's interest to preserve the building. Geddes persuaded the Earl of Rosebery, a descendant of William Gray, to stop the demolition and pay for the renovation. Architect George Shaw Aitken was tasked with restoring the building to its former glory, and the restoration work was completed in 1897. In 1907, Rosebery gifted the house to the city, and Lady Stair's house opened as a municipal museum in 1913. Museum Main Hall, showing tapestry depicting Stevenson, Scott and Burns. Designed by Archie Brennan of the Edinburgh Tapestry Company and woven at Dovecot Studios, Corstorphine, 1971. Lady Stair was a very popular patron of literature and the arts, and was well known for hosting literary gatherings. It seems therefore fitting that her house is now home to the Writers' Museum, dedicated to three of the most influential Scottish writers: Robert Burns, Sir Walter Scott, and Robert Louis Stevenson. Robert Burns. Alexander Naismith. Oil on Canvas. Robert Burns was born on a stormy night on the 25th of January 1759 into a poor farming family at Alloa in the southwest corner of Scotland. In order that his sons could receive a decent education, Robert's father made an arrangement with a local school teacher in which he would provide free board and lodging on the farm in return for tuition for Robert and his brother Gilbert. The teacher specialised in literature and taught the boys all about the works of Shakespeare. Burns at the plough, turning up the mouse. John LeConte, Gourlay Steel, Engraving. Robert wrote his first poem at the age of 15, in which he described his unrequited love for a local girl. He soon realised that he enjoyed writing poetry and was very good at it. He wrote with warmth and humour, not only about love, but also about humanity and friendship and the toils of daily life in the villages and farming communities. Burns's poems became very popular locally because ordinary people could identify with the issues and could see their own lives reflected in them. This could also be one of the reasons for Burns's popularity today. Miniature oil portrait of Jean Armour, unknown artist. Robert married the pregnant Jean Armour in 1786, but her father objected to Robert and the circumstances surrounding their marriage and tore up their marriage agreement. He also sent Jean away to spend her pregnancy with relatives, where she gave birth to twins. Robert decided to emigrate to Jamaica, but as he had no money, he hatched a plan to gain public funding for the publication of his poems, and then raise money through their sale. His Poems Chiefly in the Scottish Dialect, published in Kilmarnock, sold quickly and raised enough to pay for his voyage. Original model for Highland Mary at Dunoon, D.W. Stevenson. He was all set to leave when Burns heard that the girl he was going to emigrate with, Mary Campbell, known as Highland Mary, had died. A short time later, he learnt that his book had been well received by literary critics in Edinburgh. So, he decided to cancel his emigration plans and instead to go to the capital seeking fame and fortune. Burns arrived in Edinburgh in November 1786, a complete unknown, but almost instantly became a celebrity and the toast of Edinburgh's hoi polloi. Everyone who was anyone wanted to meet and be seen with him. He fell in love with the city, writing about Scotia's darling seat with its palaces and towers. But the same couldn't be said about his impression of its upper-class residents. He soon became tired of the false adulation from shallow people who didn't like this ill-mannered, roughneck farmer. Silhouette portrait of Clorinda, Mrs. Agnes McElhose, facsimile copy. Original by J. Mears in the Scottish National Portrait Gallery. However, Burns did meet a woman he did like. Artist and poet Nancy McElhose. They began a romantic liaison in secret, sending numerous love letters, using the pseudonyms Clorinda and Sylvander. Because even though she was estranged from her husband, Nancy was already married. Burns in Edinburgh, 1787. Reading his poem of The Winter Night before a literary gathering at the Duchess of Gordon's. Unknown artist. Charles Martin Hardy, Engraving. Burns met a young Walter Scott in James Sibbald's library bookshop and at literary gatherings, like this one, at the Duchess of Gordon's residence. He also enjoyed attending theatrical productions in the capital and became very friendly with some of the actors who had come to Edinburgh from London's Haymarket Theatre. He penned speeches for them and convinced their manager to bring the company to perform in Dumfries on their return to Scotland. Account and receipt sent to Robert Burns for the erection of a headstone on the unmarked grave of the poet Robert Fergusson, 1750 to 1774, in the Canongate Churchyard, Edinburgh, 1789. While in Edinburgh, Burns discovered that his poetic hero, Robert Fergusson, who died in an asylum in 1774, aged just 24, was buried in an unmarked grave in the Canongate Kirkyard. In 1787, Burns privately commissioned a memorial headstone to Fergusson at his own expense. In April the same year, Burns sold the publishing rights for his book to Creech, the publisher of the extended Edinburgh edition, then embarked on a tour around Scotland, collecting old ballads and airs never previously written down. He repaired and finished many of the melodies and fitted some of his poems, including Auld Lang Syne, to them. Returning to Edinburgh, Burns gave his music collection to a publisher who was compiling an encyclopedia of old Scottish music and refused to take any payment in return. Excise accounts for Dumfries, 1794 to 1796. Each sheet is certified by Burns. Deciding to return to the farm and remarry Jean in 1788, Burns wrote for Nancy a fond kiss as a break-up present. Along with running the farm, writing poetry, and attending performance by the Haymarket Players in Dumfries, Robert achieved his ambition to become an excise officer. Collecting taxes, catching smugglers, and settling land disputes around Dumfries and Galloway. Perhaps as a result of all this work, he started to suffer bouts of ill health, depression, and severe mood swings. Funeral of Robert Burns, Dumfries, July 1796. Photograph of engraving. William Ewart Lockhart. Robert died on the 21st July 1796. Some temperance campaigners claimed his abuse of alcohol contributed to his death, but many of Burns's family and acquaintances dismissed this as nonsense. It is more likely that his death may have been caused either by rheumatism, combined with a weakness in his heart, or possibly blood poisoning contracted in the process of having a tooth pulled out. His funeral, which included a military procession through Dumfries, took place 4 days later. Jean was unable to attend as she was giving birth to their 9th child. Plaster cast of Robert Burns's skull, 1834. When Jean died, she was interred in Burns's tomb, and the plaster cast of Robert's skull was taken for phrenology study. The popularity of his works grew, and Burns societies formed throughout Scotland. As Scots began to emigrate, they took Burns with them to various countries all over the world. And today, Scotland's bard, or the ploughman poet, as he is sometimes known, continues to be of huge popularity all over the world. Sir Walter Scott in his study. Sir Francis Grant, oil on canvas. Walter Scott was born in Edinburgh's Old Town on the 15th of August 1771. His father was a successful lawyer, and the family were quite wealthy. Sir Walter Scott aged 10 years. Engraved by F. Huth, after the painting by Thomas Duncan, RSA, 1807 to 1845. As a young child, Scott contracted polio. To aid his recovery, he was sent to live with his grandparents on their farm in the Scottish borders. The fresh air and country life were good for him, and although he recovered well from his illness, he was left with a permanent limp. Growing up, he continued to spend bouts of time in the Borders, and here he learned many of the tales and legends which would later shape much of his work. While there, he also attended school in Kelso and became lifelong friends with the Ballantyne brothers, who would later become his printing and publishing partners. He went on to attend Edinburgh University at just 12 years old, studying Latin and Greek, and he also began working for his father's legal practice and later studying law. He was admitted to the Faculty of Advocates in 1792. While studying, Scott attended literary salons, hosted by his friend's father, Professor Adam Ferguson. Here he met many well-renowned authors and poets, including Robert Burns. He started his own writing career by publishing translations of 2 classical German poems, and this was quickly followed by his Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border, a collection of traditional ballads inspired by his love of the folk tales and legends he heard in his youth. The Abbotsford family. Engraving by Robert Graves, ARA 1798 to 1873. Scott married Charlotte Charpentier in December 1797 and went on to have 5 children. They purchased a house in the New Town, not far from where his parents had moved to in George Square when he was a child. Sir Walter Scott's rocking horse. This rocking horse was found in the attic of his parents' former house, with legal papers belonging to his father found stuffed into a pad in the seat to act as a cushion. The footrests on either side are fixed at different heights to accommodate his disability. Scott went on to publish many poems based on Scottish history and legend, including the hugely popular Marmion and The Lady of the Lake, and had become established as the foremost poet of his time. He then decided to start writing novels and short stories. But as novels were considered vastly inferior to poetry, Scott instructed Ballantyne to publish them anonymously to avoid tarnishing his poetic reputation. His first novel, entitled Waverley, was an instant success and received great critical acclaim. Scott wrote 26 books anonymously, among them Rob Roy and Ivanhoe, which became known as the Waverley novels, even though they were completely unconnected. None of the novels bore Scott's name. Instead, they all had "by the author of Waverley," where his name should have appeared. Playbill, Theatre Royal, Edinburgh, 5th January 1829, featuring the dramatisation of Scott's Heart of Midlothian. A theatre enthusiast, Scott became patron of the Edinburgh Theatre Royal and formed lifelong friendships with top London actors, some of whom produced dramatised versions of his works for performances in Edinburgh and London. The plays were hugely popular, playing to packed houses throughout the 19th century. Study for Sir Walter Scott and his literary friends at Abbotsford. Thomas Fide. Oil on Panel, circa 1853 to 1854. Scott purchased an old farmhouse in the Scottish borders and began converting it into a small castle, which he called Abbotsford. With his books being translated into a variety of different languages and selling in millions around the world, Scott had become a very wealthy man. So, no expense was spared, installing state-of-the-art heating, plumbing, and sanitation. Developing a taste for the high life through Charlotte's influence, Scott invited celebrities and other influential figures, such as Lord Byron, for weekend parties at his country retreat. The procession of King George IV entering Princes Street. Edinburgh, August 1822. William Turner, Oil on Canvas. For his visit to Edinburgh in 1822, King George IV invited Scott to stage manage the pageantry and ceremony. He cleverly used the king's visit to unite the clans and make the previously banned wearing of tartan fashionable. Sir Walter Scott at Abbotsford. Sir John Watson Gordon, Oil on Canvas. In 1825, a national financial crash plunged Scott into serious debt. He had been receiving advances from his publishers to pay for the building of Abbotsford and acquisition of surrounding land, and the purchase of military armour and weapons to add to his extensive collection. Those publishers took unsecured loans from the banks in order to pay those advances, but the crisis forced many publishers out of business, and so Scott had to repay the banks himself. He suddenly found himself in debt to the tune of £6 million in today's money. Scott sold his house in Edinburgh and moved his family into Abbotsford. He vowed to write his way out of debt, revealed to the world that he was the author of the Waverley novels, and worked furiously often through severe illness, to produce more and more bestsellers, including his epic biography of Napoleon. A series of strokes forced him to stop writing, but by the time he died, in 1832, Scott had cleared nearly all his debt. The architect's drawing of the Scott Monument. Edinburgh. George Meikle Kemp. Ink and wash on paper. Deeply affected by the death of their national treasure, the Scottish people demanded a monument befitting the stature of this world-famous literary icon. And so, a competition was held to find the design. Many great architects from around the world submitted entries, but the competition was won by George Meikle Kemp, a carpenter who worked in churches around the Scottish borders, and an acquaintance of Scott. The Scott Monument, built and paid for by the Scottish people and until recently the world's tallest monument to a writer, has become an iconic feature of Edinburgh's landscape. Robert Louis Stevenson, 1850 to 1894. Robert Stevenson, Count Girolamo Pieri Nelli, oil on canvas, circa 1900. Robert Louis Stevenson, aged 7. Born in Edinburgh on the 13th of November 1850, Robert Louis Balfour Stevenson was the only child of lighthouse builder Thomas Stevenson. He was a very sickly child, suffering severe coughing due to lung problems, and so he was unable to attend school for most of his childhood. Most of his tutoring was done by his nanny, Alison Cunningham. Alison was an excellent storyteller and would often enthrall young Robert with tales of Scottish history and legend. Wooden cabinet made by William Deacon Brodie, 1780 to 1781. This cabinet stood in Stevenson's childhood bedroom, and it's quite possible that Alison would have told him the story of its maker, the infamous Deacon Brodie. William Deacon Brodie was a very respected cabinet maker and city councilman by day, and notorious womanising thief by night. And his story may well have been an inspiration for Robert's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He was certainly very interested in Brodie, because he wrote a play about him and explored the duality of the human condition in much of his writing. The Pentland Rising, A Page of History, 1666. He demonstrated proficiency in writing from an early age, and at 16 penned Pentland Rising, about the massacre of the Covenanters at the Battle of Rullion Green. His proud father paid to have the story published. Stevenson dressed as Sir Charles Pomander in Art and Nature, 1877. Stevenson had a love of theatre, and he was an enthusiastic actor in amateur dramatics productions at the home of family friends, the Fleeming Jenkins. He studied engineering at Edinburgh University But after telling his parents that he was determined to become a writer, was advised by his father to switch to study law instead, so he could earn a living as a lawyer when the writing didn't pay. He gained his law degree, but did not actively seek legal work, preferring instead to go travelling. He embarked on a canoe trip along the canals of France and Belgium with his good friend Walter Simpson, and his journal, An Inland Voyage, was published. Fanny Matilda van de Grift Osborne, at about the time she met Robert Louis Stevenson. While in France, Robert met his future wife, Fanny, and her daughter at an artist colony in Grèce. He used the colony as a base for travelling around France. After 2 years, Fanny decided to return home to California to make or break her existing marriage with her estranged husband. Heartbroken, Robert went on a trek through the French countryside, accompanied only by a stubborn donkey called Modestine. His journal, Travels with a Donkey in the Cevennes, was published in 1879. On hearing from Fanny that her marriage was over, Robert jumped on a ship bound for New York. Then embarked on a hazardous train journey across the United States to be with her. The trip made him seriously ill, and Fanny spent the first few months of their marriage caring for Robert in the cabin of a deserted silver mine in the Napa Valley. Robert gave an account of his adventures in An Amateur Immigrant and The Silverado Squatters. As soon as Robert was well enough, the couple continued travelling, accompanied by Fanny's son, Lloyd. Whilst on holiday with his parents in Braemar, Robert began work on a pirate adventure story that would soon make him famous. Originally entitled The Sea Cook and serialised in a magazine for young people, Treasure Island has never been out of print since its publication in 1883. Skerryvore, Etching, Leslie M. Ward, 1918. Robert's father bought him a house, Skerryvore, in Bournemouth. It was here that Robert Louis Stevenson started work on The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Kidnapped, and A Child's Garden of Verses. In 1888, Robert and Fanny went on a 6-month cruise of the Pacific Islands, including a visit to Samoa. Vai Lima, Count Girolamo Pieri Nerli, watercolour on paper. Here, Stevenson bought land and started building a house. Vai Lima. The Samoan people took him to their hearts and gave him the name Tusitala, meaning teller of tales. Stevenson helped them in their struggles against oppression, speaking out against Great Britain, amongst other countries. He also wrote a series of short stories set on the islands, entitled The Ebb Tide. On 3rd of December 1894, whilst working on Weir of Hermiston, Robert Louis Stevenson took a break to make lunch, but suddenly suffered a brain hemorrhage, collapsed and died in his kitchen. Stevenson's tomb. A group of friends carried his body to the top of a mountain overlooking his house, and there he was laid to rest. The inscription on his grave reads, "Under the wide and starry sky, dig the grave and let me lie. Glad did I live and gladly die, and I laid me down with a will." Book Sculpture. Unknown artist, 2010. Adjacent to the photograph of Stevenson's grave is one of the book sculptures created and gifted to the museum by an unknown artist. One of 10 secretly deposited in various literary establishments around Edinburgh in 2011. To make this piece, the artist created a scene from Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, using a copy of Ian Rankin's crime novel Hide and Seek. Ian Rankin's works have been featured many times in temporary exhibitions within the museum, as well as other more contemporary authors, including J.K. Rowling and Muriel Spark. Macker's Court. Outside, in the courtyard, Macker's Court is an evolving national literary monument. Where you can see some of the famous words of great Scottish writers inscribed in the flagstones. The Scots word macker means one who fashions, constructs, produces, prepares, etc. And in the literary context, it is the role of the poet or author as a skilled and versatile worker in the craft of writing. We have many such folk living in Scotland, and to celebrate the importance of writers in our lives, in this city of literature, Edinburgh has adopted its own version of the Poet Laureate, the Edinburgh Macker. Inscribed in the flagstones are quotes ranging from the 14th century John Barber to Dame Muriel Spark, who died in 2006. The first stone was unveiled in 1997, and new flagstones are added on a regular basis. We hope that you have enjoyed this whistle-stop tour of the Writers' Museum. There is so much more to explore in our galleries, and so many stories to uncover. So why not pay us a visit soon? To learn more about upcoming events and exhibitions, visit edinburghmuseums.org.uk or follow us on Facebook at Edinburgh Museums and Galleries, or on Twitter at Edin Culture.